Okay, so the next step is sewing the sleeve to the actual bodice. This specific view is for views 2 and 4. If you are doing views 1 and 3, then of course you'll have the arm facing that you'll want to put in, and that's in a different video that I'll link in the description box. But this is for views 2 and 4 for the sleeve version. And so what we're gonna do, I'm not going to do another flat felt seam because I think you get the point for how to do that when we did our shoulder seams. But just to give a basic a diagram for how you would do it is you would match your middle notch from your sleeve to the seam of the shoulder. So the shoulder seam to the sleeve middle notch, you match them together. Then you'll backstitch your sleeve to the bodice all the way down using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then of course you'll choose your seam allowance to trim, and then fold over the larger seam allowance over the smaller seam allowance and whip stitch it in place. Now, something to keep in mind when you're doing this is that you want to decide which way you want your seam allowance to fall. So for instance, I already did this side for my arm attachment to the bodice, and on this side I decided to fold over the largest seam allowance toward the sleeve instead of towards the bodice, and so the little small stitches from my whip stitches show up on the sleeve. If you did it the opposite way, if you folded your seam allowance towards the bodice, then the little small stitches would be on your bodice. Doesn't really matter as much. Most times the seam allowance, especially for this pattern, they are pressed towards the actual sleeve. So that's just something to keep in mind. This technically would be the correct way to do it, but it doesn't really matter. However you want to do it is completely up to you. This is how it will look relatively, of course, depending on who's sewing. These are the back of my back stitches. So what I, clearly these are the back of them. So really the way that I sewed it, if I wanted the right side of my back stitches to show, then I would have pressed it this way. But again, doesn't really matter. The back stitches are still in place and it looks perfectly fine. Alternatively, you can do a French seam to put your sleeve onto your bodice with. If you do a French seam though to sew your sleeve to your bodice, just keep in mind that it will cause some bulk in the underarm because we are French seaming the side seams and underarm. So there's nothing wrong with that. It just may be a little bulky to sew when you get to the underarm area of your top or dress. So just keep that in mind. You can French seam the sleeve if you want to, instead of doing a flat felt seam. Either which one is good for you. I'm going to demonstrate how to do a French seam now on the side seams so that you can see what the next step is after you've attached your sleeve to your bodice. And then after we do our side seams, then we'll move on to finishing the sleeve and the cuff. So to start French seams, we are on the right side of our fabric first. So we start on the right side and then we turn our work inside out, or really outside in, and then we work from the wrong side. So we're doing 2 lines of stitching. First, we'll start with using a running stitch, which I've already demonstrated here, and I will zoom in so you can see. But we are doing 2 lines of stitching, so we'll need 2 seam allowances. It depends and varies based off of what your seam allowance is for the full seam allowance. For instance, we have a full 1/2 seam allowance for this garment. And so our first line of stitching will need to be 1/4 inch. And then when we turn our work outside in, then we'll have another 1/4 inch of stitching. Generally, you'll want to trim your seam down to half of its width, your seam allowance down to half of its width, so that when you turn it inside out, there are no pieces sticking out from your last line of stitching. And I'll demonstrate what I mean by that in one moment when we get to sewing. But just want to demonstrate, the beginning of how to do a French seam. And so what I start off doing here is I start with a running stitch. You can very well do both of your seams with a back stitch. There's nothing wrong with that. And decide what works best for you. I start mine with a running stitch just because it's faster, and what I do is I make small running stitches so that it's, still sturdy enough. And then I switch and turn outside in and then do a back stitch for my final stitch. And so when I say I'm doing a running stitch, I am just doing running stitches up the width of my garment. I had a little bit of a hiccup here for this underarm, so please ignore that. But then we just continue going until you get to the end of the sleeve. And just match your underarm seams with each other so that you're having a nice foundation for the back stitches you're about to do. And you're going to go all the way to the end using, again, 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Now, Photinia has, of course, a lot of ease. So if it's easier, you can do a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. It shouldn't hurt anything. You can do a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then what you'll do is you will do 1/4 inch seam allowance and then 3/8 of an inch seam allowance afterward. So you can also do that as well. My math may not have been right there, but you get the point. I'm a little bit scatterbrained today, but you get the point of what I'm trying to say. Pretty much you start with a smaller seam allowance first and then use the bigger seam allowance for your second go around when you're stitching. So I'm just going to running stitch the rest of this sleeve, and then I will show you how to do it from the other side to backstitch the rest of your side seam so that you can finish your French seam. Okay, so we have finished our running stitches throughout the length of our side seams. This is the perfect time to clip into your underarm or trim/grade it so that there's a little more slack there when you turn it outside in. You don't want any puckering or any issues on the underarm because once the other side is sewn, it's sewn. It can't be, you can undo it, of course, but you don't want to have to go backtrack on your French seams. So once this is done, then we're going to turn it inside out or outside in, depending on how you view it. And then again, as you can see, this is why it was very beneficial for me personally to do flat felled seams, because it's just nice and smooth here. There's no puckering, there's no issues, any bulk or anything. It'll just be a nice smooth sew as I go down this underarm seam. And so as you can see, we've turned it inside out. This is the perfect time to finger press the area down. Doesn't matter which way. You just want the seam to be flat because you're about to fold it and hold it down so that the two sides are together. So just go throughout the length of the garment and just finger press that seam down. Make sure there's no puckering or anything like that on the side seams. Just make sure it's completely flat for what you're about to do. You can even spread it a little bit. And then, yeah. I'm having some wins with the pattern matching of this fabric, but I didn't really take it seriously, so don't mind it too much if it bothers you. Okay, so now that we've done that, we are going to, and again, before you even do this, if you want to trim the inside seam allowance a little more, you can trim off these little pieces so that they don't get caught when you're doing your second seam of the French seams, because they will stick out once you're finished. So if you want to go through and trim this area just to get rid of all the little, pieces, then you can. Also, it makes it easier so that you can sew the seam allowance easy. So I'm going to trim this area. I checked the other area, but I didn't check the bottom. I'm going to trim this really small. When you're doing a 1/2 inch seam allowance, it's kind of tricky. You have to do a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and it's kind of hard because you don't want to get so close to the stitching that the stitching eventually comes out. So just keep that in mind when you're doing a French seam. So I'm just going to trim this a little bit. And I think that's good. And so now we're going to turn inside out, and we're going to sew the same seam with a back stitch this time. So the thing that'll help with this, just so you can make sure you keep it even, is you can use your seam gauge and measure out a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then you can just keep that measurement in mind as you go down and and pin your seam allowance in place. It's good to pin it in place just so it doesn't shift from the finger pressing you just did, and so the seam stays straight and isn't wonky. So I'm just going to pin down the length of this. And actually, I should be going this way since I'll be holding my work this way. So I'll start at the sleeve. So you can start at the sleeve if you want. Measure your seam allowance and then pin the area down throughout the length of the side seam. And then you're going to backstitch that same seam in place as you go. And then your French seam will be finished. And so then you're going to do the same thing as we did with everything in these past few steps. You're going to do on the other side of your bodice. So you're going to sew your sleeve to the bodice using a flat felled seam or a French seam, depending on your preference, but I used a flat felled seam. And then you're going to French seam the side seams, trimming if you like to get rid of the little pieces, using a 1/2 inch seam allowance or a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, whichever works for you. And then we are going to move on to the arms, the sleeves, and do the cuffs and gather them and move on to the next step. So I am going to finish this. We are going to backstitch the seam, and we'll come back here. All right, so since a lot of the steps that follow the side seams are pretty redundant for the rest of your garment, after you've done the other side, I just want to walk through some basic steps with you so you have a little bit of a guide as to how to proceed forward. Next should be gathering your sleeve. Gathering your sleeve, you're just going to do the same thing at the bottom of your sleeve as you did for the neckline. You're going to do 2 rows of basting or running stitches, and then you're going to pull them. It's for putting on the cuff, it's the same construction as when you put on your binding. You're going to back stitch the cuff onto your sleeve, and then you're going to fold over, and then you're going to put the folded part under, and then you're going to top stitch that or slip stitch that into place. So you can back stitch from the outside, or you can slip stitch that into place. This sample is not hand sewn, by the way. This is a sample that I had previously made, but the same concepts apply. After that, you should be completely done with your bodice area, and then you can move on to your bottom hemming. If you are doing hem facings, I will have a video for that in the coming weeks to share with you. For the lower back facing though, you should have 2 pieces like this that came from the cutting of your neckline. So you should have two pieces like this. If you threw them away, hopefully you can still grab them out of the trash because this is a zero waste pattern. But you should have two pieces that look like this. What you'll do is you'll just backstitch these together around the curved edges using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So you'll backstitch around the curved edges, not this piece, though you can base this closed if you want to. Then you'll turn it inside out and then press it to make sure it's flat. What you'll end up with is a piece like this. This is on the inside of my fabric. You'll end up with a piece like this. Hopefully you can see, but you'll end up with a piece like this, and you just top stitch this to your garment. I will also have another follow-up video to show you how to top stitch your lower back facing to the hem of your garment. You'll have to do it from the outside. So you can choose to use a running stitch, and then it'll show up on both sides of your fabric. So you can choose to do it on this side and it'll show up the same on this side. Or you can backstitch from the outside, which I will show you how to do in another video in the coming weeks. So you can choose to do that for the bottom of this, and then all you'll have left to do is fold up your hem over that facing piece so that it hides the raw edge, and then you'll hem your garment using a running stitch or a back stitch. I will also have a video for that in the coming weeks as well.